According to my dentist, I should get my wisdom teeth removed. That definitely isn't gonna hurt. Invincible Season 3, Episode 6 has finally arrived, and this episode has an extremely serious tone to it. There were one or two small happy victories for our characters, but for most of them, they go through some pretty rough crap. But before we get to all the moral challenges and questions yet to come, be sure to hit the like and sub button if you enjoyed this video, and if you've been enjoying my coverage of Invincible Season 3 in general. But that's enough self-promotion. Let's talk about Invincible Season 3, Episode 6. All I can say is, I'm sorry. First of all, that title alone tells you this is probably going to be a pretty heart-wrenching episode. And second of all, this episode opens with a flashback to Chicago back when Mark and his dad had that big fight. Remember that building Mark tried to stop from falling and that mother and daughter that he failed to save? Well, we learned that their relative Scott was actually present during the attack. But before we go any further, a little bit of backstory on Scott. We learned that he was visiting Chicago for Gretchen's 10th birthday. That's the little girl. Gretchen's mother and Scott's sister's name is Jessica. Scott is Gretchen's uncle, and he seems like he has some sort of like low-level ability to absorb kinetic energy and create like electricity from it. Think of it like a fusion of, I guess, like Black Panther's armor and Electro's abilities. Scott went to get a coffee while his sister and niece went back to their apartment. And I don't know if I'd call it exactly fortunate, but that coffee run ended up saving Scott's life. From a distance, he sees the building fall, and then he sees Mark holding his sister's arm and then dropping it. Even though Mark was trying to save them and stop his father, you can see how seeing something like that from that perspective would make anyone paint Mark as the villain in that moment. After this, we see a scene of Scott. Whew, that was a lot of S words. We see Scott pleading to his district attorney about a legal case that he's been preparing against Invincible. As he's on the ground pleading to the district attorney, he explains that his sister basically raised him after their parents died a long time ago. So not only did Mark fail to save Scott's sister, an innocent woman, but he failed to save the person who basically helped him through all the rough times after their parents had died. And losing someone like that in such a horrible way is just completely awful. Scott is angry because Invincible isn't under any kind of legal investigation and calls Mark a murderer. The district attorney is quick to point out that Invincible was trying to defend the planet from Omni-Man, but Scott is quick to retort that how do we know that, and how are we supposed to know that for sure? Obviously us, the viewer, know exactly what happened and that Mark was in fact trying to save the planet, because he's a good guy. But the regular people who witnessed all of that horror and destruction and tragedy firsthand, they're not entirely in the wrong to ask questions or seek proper legal justice. After all, as Scott puts it, if he's so innocent as the district attorney claims, open a legal investigation and prove it. Without Omni-Man around, everyone who's in a remotely similar situation to Scott is going to direct all of their anger and their want for consequence toward Invincible. But the district attorney states that our laws don't apply in situations like this. And understandably, as a mostly regular guy, Scott gets really pissed off at this statement. And this shot of Scott's reflection in the car window really says it all. He's angry. He is frustrated. He wants justice. Next, we learn that Scott has gotten a job at the GDA, no less. And we see Scott watching footage of Mark from the Chicago attacks with the intensity of a conspiracy theorist. He sees how Mark is struggling against Omni-Man, and Scott is just struggling to accept that Invincible is a good guy. Then he looks behind his computer screen and sees these scientists working on these like energy storage disk thingies. Just keep those in mind for later. At lunchtime with the GDA crew, Scott is still grumpy about Invincible, about how he gets to walk free with thousands dead in his wake. One of his co-workers is very quick to defend Mark because, after all, he saved the entire planet from Viltrumite takeover. But Scott's other co-worker kind of agrees with him. Even aside from the matter of the whole Omni-Man fight, Mark did break into the Pentagon recently, and anyone else in that situation who breaks into the Pentagon will be sentenced for life. But ultimately she concludes that Mark is their best chance and best weapon against the threat of a Viltrumite invasion. And Oliver, too, when he grows up. Speaking of Oliver, we get this fun little training scene where Mark and Eve are advising Oliver as he takes on the elephant. Even now, Oliver isn't listening to Mark, and Eve points out that who wants to listen to their older brother? Like, who would want to do that? So Eve gives Oliver some advice, and Oliver takes the advice wholeheartedly and is like, "Yep, thanks, Eve, I appreciate the tip." and Mark is just left comically bewildered. After they're all done, they sit down to have a bite to eat, and they talk some more about Omni-Man. Once again, Oliver viciously defends his father like there's no tomorrow, and Eve gently asks Oliver, what is this really about? And we get a pretty endearing but also kind of sad explanation from Oliver as he opens up a little bit. Oliver says that he has like a really good, like crystal clear memory, and he speculates that he gets that from his Thraxan side. And he remembers when he was super young how his dad would fly him around the castle and sing songs to him and just be this really nice guy. Mark makes the observation that their dad was two different people. The loving parent they both knew as a kid, and the Viltrumite who tried to conquer the planet Earth. Oliver never really knew his father's real, true Viltrumite side, and he struggles to understand why people can't forgive him. But Mark understands more than anybody who his father really turned out to be, and where he really came from. Call back. This scene gives some really good insight as to why Oliver is so pro-Omni-Man, because Oliver only ever knew his father's good side. He learned and was told about what his father had done to Earth and all the horrible things he did, and he understands that they were a bad thing, but he didn't experience it like Mark did. And the scene ends with them at an impasse. A little bit less of an impasse than Mark and Oliver were at before, but still an impasse nonetheless. We cut back over to Scott, and he's practicing his speech for when he faces Invincible, in front of his wife. His wife, who is in fact encouraging him. Piece of advice, darling. This type of behavior is not something to be encouraged. Remember those energy disc things we saw at the GDA? Well, Scott stole 6 of them, and his wife willingly and happily injects them into Scott's body. It enhances his low-level absorption ability by a great margin, and how does he test out if this works? He has his wife slams his chest and head with a friggin' sledgehammer. Seriously, woman, you are doing this man no favors. But due to all the noise these two crazies are making, they wake up their kid. Yes, they have a child, and I wouldn't exactly call these two qualified parents, just based on how they deal with grief alone. Over to the Grayson household, the whole family is having a nice dinner. We have Mark, Eve, Debbie, Paul, and of course, the purple kid, Oliver. They have a conversation about what they've all been up to, and when it's Paul's turn, he talks about his early ventures into real estate. And shortly after dinner, Paul expresses to Debbie that he feels like he can't measure up to her family or Eve. They save the world, he sells houses. But Debbie reinforces that their lives are just as meaningful, and they can serve as a way to keep Mark and Oliver grounded in the real world. But Eve fits perfectly between the civilian and superhero life, if you ask me. I mean, hell, she is taking college architecture classes to learn how to build things better so she can use her superpowers to, like, build things for construction companies. That is so freaking smart. Also, there's this scene where Oliver is spying on Debbie and Paul kissing.
Ah, you're at that creepy age where you spy on girls, huh?
We see Mark and crew go bowling again with William and Rick. And William, once again, even though he has superhero friends, dominates all of them at the sport of bowling. Not only is this scene a nice little callback to when they went bowling in season 2, but it's also William's birthday. And what he wants for his birthday is simply
the look on your faces as I beat you over and over again.
Real talk now, William is hella underrated in my opinion. And who else shows up to William's B-Day bowling party? That's right, you know her, you love her, everyone's favorite, Amber. Look, she's not that bad to have on screen, and hey, in this scene, her and Mark get to have a little bit more positive closure, and they both get to say that they're happy for one another. And we do get this funny little scene where Amber asks Mark not to use his powers for bowling, and Mark is quick to point out that he is not the real threat when it comes to this sport. But when the two come back from getting snacks, Scott is on the TV demanding for Invincible to come and show himself. But Mark quickly shuts the TV off because, let's be honest, man deserves a night off, and it's William's birthday. Scott is going kind of mental though, and we get this like goofy little sequence of Scott demanding Invincible show up, and every time Scott says his name, the title card flashes for like half a second. Here, lay your eyes on this. This is unedited.
This is about the thousands of people murdered and the countless other lives destroyed. Why is above the law? Why does never pay for his crimes?
It feels like one of those meme clips or something. But Shapesmith shows up to try and deal with Scott. although the beating Shapesmith dishes out only makes Scott stronger. Scott retaliates hard, and he puts Shapesmith down for the count. And as Scott tries to plead self-defense, saying that Shapesmith attacked him, all of the bystanders look on in fear of Scott. He's getting similar looks to the looks people gave Omni-Man. And I think Scott realized that in this moment because he then just flies off. But Scott goes back home and vents to his wife about how confused and frustrated he is that Mark didn't show up. And his wife says that if he had showed up in front of all those cameras, he'd have proved your point. Good Christ, these two have a serious vengeance problem. Anyone know a good counselor? So Scott picks the next time for him to go out. He picks tomorrow, at a remembrance ceremony in Chicago. Mark and the family attend as normal people, and Mark asks Eve if he should even be going in the first place. Eve reinforces that for one, he's not going as Invincible, and two, whether Mark wants to admit it or not, he was a victim of Chicago. But while Mark and company fly to Chicago, a quick intermission. And now, for your regularly scheduled unnamed superhero team that used to be Teen Team and Guardians of the Globe sitcom episode. Over at the old Teen Team base, Rudy is finishing up a project that he's been working on tirelessly. A belt that should, in theory, prevent Monster Girl from de-aging every time she transforms. Along with some sick hacker beats as he works, of course. That goes pretty hard. When it's time to show Monster Girl what he's done, he has a very noticeable sense of excitement and enthusiasm in his voice. Most times we've seen Rudy on screen, he's been more like monotone and cold than emotionless. But he actually has some genuine emotion and excitement in his voice for a change. And after a successful test, it seems that Rudy's belt has stopped Monster Girl from de-aging. Although, before we celebrate, she did say it felt strange when she transformed back. Not bad strange, just strange. So maybe there's an unknown or unforeseen side effect of this belt that Rudy is yet to notice. But either way, Monster Girl cries with happiness and gives Rudy a big old hug as Ray watches this all unfold from the background. Ray heads to Rex's room to admit that she's quitting, even though she just admitted and agreed that there was some magic.
Magic scares the shit out of me.
Sorry, half magic going on between those two. Rex, of course, is a little bit upset and hesitant about this because, there is something going on between those two. There's something there, and they start getting a bit argumentative about the subject. But Ray takes Rex's hand and is like, I don't want my last night here to be spent cooped up in your room and having a fight. So instead, they head up to the roof to have a nice chat. Much better view, much cleaner air. Ray opens up that she had a lot of time in the hospital to think about what she wants out of her life after a lizard man ate her and Rex got shot in the head. She doesn't want to keep going out there until something horrible like that happens again because, let's be honest, it's probably going to happen again. And she worries that next time they won't make it. And that could be for a variety of reasons. For one, it's like, you can only evade death once or whatever, but for two, they wouldn't have GDA support that time. And Ray looks into Rex's eyes and genuinely asks him, are you happy almost getting killed every day whilst normal people get to live the lives we never could? And Ray admits that she wants that kind of life, and maybe she wants that kind of life with Rex. After Ray takes Rex's hands, Rex gets serious. He asks Ray if she knows his real last name. Obviously she doesn't, and nor do we, but we learn that Rex's real last name is Sloan. Rex explains and expresses that he doesn't get to be happy because when the government took him and changed him, they pretty much erased all of his identity records and personal records his social security number and stuff like that. He has no individual records outside of what the government has given him. And Rex explains that Rex Splode isn't some secret identity, it's his identity, and it's all he's ever really had. He feels if he gives that up, he won't really have anything left. Ray doesn't think that's true, but Rex replies with,
Yeah, well, then I guess you don't know me as well as you think you do.
You can really hear in Rex's voice that he really didn't want to say this. The identity of Rex Splode means something really important to Rex, and he doesn't want to give that up. But he doesn't want Ray to leave either, and it's plainly obvious by his expression and tone of voice. The two hug each other, and Ray says she's still going to leave, and Rex replies with, I know. He doesn't say, I wish you wouldn't. He doesn't say, I'm going to miss you in any sort of attempt to guilt Rey. He completely and utterly respects her decision. He respects her decision with just 2 words. He voices no further opposition and wholeheartedly accepts her choice. And this kiss right here could not be more deserving. The two clearly like each other, and over 3.5 seasons, Rex has become someone truly worthy of loving. In this season alone, we see Rex make mistakes, learn from those mistakes extremely quickly, might I add, does everything he can to make up for it, and shows nothing but respect and support for the person he's romantically interested in. I know I just did a whole video saying this, but Rexplode really has come a long way, both as a hero, a lover, and a friend. And this rooftop scene feels like the end of Rexplode's emotional maturity arc. And I wouldn't have it any other way, quite frankly. Okay, this script is getting pretty long, so let's turn our attention back to Mark Scott and that whole Chicago kerfuffle. At the Chicago Remembrance Ceremony, everything is going fine. Until Scott shows up. He takes charge of the ceremony and starts listing off the names of some of the people who have died, including his sister and niece. As the crowd is fleeing, some of them stop and turn and listen to Scott as he's listing off names of people they knew. Not many of them, but a few of the crowd's folks stop and turn. Scott demands that Invincible show himself and face justice at the hands of Powerplex. Eve tells Mark to let her handle this, and Debbie reinforces that it would probably be a bad idea for Mark to get involved since Scott is clearly disturbed. And this fact becomes very apparent later on. In this fight, in just a minute, Eve figures out that hitting Scott makes him stronger. So what does she do? Fucking gums his ass. The Guardians and the GDA show up to take Scott into custody. For about 5 minutes anyway. But back at the ceremony site, Mark is questioning if these deaths actually are on his hands or not. Powerplex is acting in the victims' names, and if he had hurt anyone at this ceremony today, wouldn't that technically be Mark's fault too? Eve doesn't get the chance to respond before the scene cuts off, but it's also probably because she just doesn't really have a solid answer at the moment. It's all really, gray. But later in the night, we get one of those small victories I was talking about. We learn that Donald, the absolute cyborg legend, has been helping out Mark in secret. And Donald gives Mark some info on Scott to help him understand what's going on. God, Donald is such a Chad. He is the glue that keeps the GDA together. Let's just be honest with ourselves. As Mark and Donald are talking though, Scott sends them a staged video of him abducting an innocent woman, when in reality it's his wife and child. Okay, seriously, what the fuck, woman? You are willing to tie up your own child, put duct tape over their mouth, and endanger them all for revenge? You need serious help. So Mark finally bites the bullet and confronts Powerplex. Initially, it seems like there won't be any need for violence or a fight, as Scott sort of breaks down in tears and sort of listens to what Mark is saying to him. That is until Mark says this.
But hurting other people won't bring your sister and niece back.
Yeah, bad move, Mark. That is not something you should ever say to someone in any situation. It only ever makes it worse. They start fighting, and Scott must pack some kind of a punch to be throwing Mark around like this. Some rubble falls near Scott's wife and kid, and Mark points out that he's going to get them killed. Scott retorts that Mark is the killer, and that he'll put a stop to Mark permanently so he can never kill innocents again. Yeah, Scott is too far gone at this point. Mark, even armed with the knowledge of how Scott's powers work, takes a risky move. He kicks Scott into the wall and some rubble falls on top of him, immobilizing him for the moment, giving Mark a chance to save the innocent civilians. But Scott's wife spits in Mark's face and calls him a monster. This moment of confusion lets Scott get the jump on Mark, and Scott unleashes all of his power to try and fry Mark's brain. Seems to be a theme this season, huh? He doesn't kill Mark, but all of that energy being released did fry his wife and child alive. So after breaking down in tears and realizing he has nothing left to lose, Scott goes full psycho and pushes his limits. Mark takes hold of Scott to absorb all that energy and prevent a massive explosion, and Mark actually ends up bleeding a bit. But Mark manages to absorb all that energy, and then we cut to a scene of Scott in prison. Mark makes an attempt to try and comfort Scott about how much pain Chicago caused him as well, because as Eve said, Mark was a victim too. But all this does is make Scott angrier and swear ultimate vengeance upon Invincible. Mark goes home afterward and Eve asks if he wants to talk, but Mark doesn't say anything and just embraces her. To be fair, I don't think I would have anything to say after something like that either. And close by, once again, we see one of Angstrom Levy's drones spying on the two. The credits roll, and the post-credit scene gives us a look at Angstrom Levy and how he's doing. Yeah, he's not looking too good, is he? I still do not understand how he's alive. And apparently, Angstrom recruited like 20 versions of evil Mark to try and kill the one good Mark. You remember those evil versions of Mark from Season 2? Why in the hell are they working with Angstrom Levy? If I recall correctly, almost every single one of them had killed or almost killed the Angstrom Levy of their timeline. Also, get a look at some of those costumes. The black and yellow with the cape is hands down my favorite, but the red and white as a sort of like reflection of Omni-Man's suit, that one's pretty cool too. Some are goofier than others, but I gotta say, Mark pulls off that Viltrumite uniform very, very nicely. But with that massive cliffhanger, Invincible Season 3 Episode 6 comes to a close. And I guess we're gonna see Mark fight himself for the next 2 episodes. This is the second episode in a row where Mark's views, values, morals, and just all of that junk has been questioned. Last episode, it was Titan questioning him, and granted, the moral and questioning and challenging wasn't as intensive last episode, but it was still very much present, and now we have Scott doing the same thing to him in this episode. It seems one of the overarching themes of Season 3 has been questioning of morals, values, and ideals, and I am all for it. But let's be honest with ourselves. Scott was very disturbed, and his wife was doing him no favors. But hearing Mark question if he should face the consequences of his actions for incidents like Chicago, as well as any incidents that are a result of previous incidents are his fault or not, was really interesting and captivating. It is so important for our protagonists to be challenged, not just in terms of their physical or whatever their like fighting ability, but also their moral standings and their ideological abilities. That is just as important, because it plants the seeds for future character growth. And speaking of character growth, Rexplode just can't get enough of it. Maybe next episode Rex will change his mind and decide he wants to go with Ray. Or maybe he won't and stay behind, but start questioning what it means to be Rexplode. With his maturity arc over, I think it's time for Rexplode's identity arc to begin. Either way, I could not be more excited for these final 2 episodes. Even after Season 3 ends, I still plan to make a bunch of Season 3 and just Invincible related videos in general, like updating my episodes tier list for one, and maybe some character breakdowns, and a couple other ideas I have that I'm still not entirely sure about. But there's gonna be plenty more Invincible content to come after Season 3 ends, so be sure to hit the like and sub button if you want to stick around for that. And if you want to show me a little bit of extra support and really like the way I do things around here, then definitely consider becoming a channel member. Not only do you get a whole bunch of exclusive rewards, but you also directly support me in the process, and I would just appreciate it a whole bunch. But that's gonna do it for now. Thank you so much for watching, and yeah, have a good day, everyone.